than any other country in the world, proportionate to population. Russia used to be ahead of us, no longer. We have over 2 million people behind bars, and even more on probation and parole. Now, obviously, and by the way, Black Americans constitute the largest single group behind prison. 6 times as many Black Americans, mainly young men, are incarcerated compared with whites, 6 times as many, and over twice as many compared with Hispanics. So this is a huge group which can't even vote. Only in 2 states, Vermont and Maine, can you actually vote while you're in prison. By the way, Canada allows that, so does Israel, but only 2 states. The other states vary. In some cases, you can vote as soon as you walk out, but that's not most of them. In the largest single number, you have to wait for probation or parole, which can be 4 years. Then you can vote. But most depressing, there are states where you lose your vote entirely if you serve time or be convicted as a felon. For example, in the state of Virginia, if you want to get back on the voting rolls, I called up on the website. They have a form you fill out, and you have to get references from 3 people to get your vote back. You have to send what appears to be a personal letter to the governor. Dear Governor, this is why I feel I'm entitled to vote again. Well, you can imagine how many people pass that test. Not many. So we have a lot of Americans, disproportionately Black, who are going to be voteless for life.
You know, what's interesting about the different laws in every state around whether a felon can vote is the effect it has on states where actually you can vote, but you may not know that. And so while not the majority of states actually allow people who have served time, who have committed felonies, to vote, they think that they can't.
They think that they can't, and it's a huge bureaucratic labyrinth on this. And in one state, at least, they have a list of people who, no matter what, will never be able to vote. One is violent carjacking, all right. Another is possessing child pornography, and a third is treason. You know, the state.
Alabama.
Well, Alabama. I guess that's treason against Alabama. Now, what I'd say is, my view is, if you've served your time, that's it. But not in Alabama.
You have an interesting figure in Mississippi. You say with 155,127 men and women released between 1992 and 2004, only 107 petitions to have the right to vote restored were approved. Out of over 155,000 people who served time in jail, 107 petitions. The disenfranchisement of former felons in Kentucky has reduced its potential Black electorate by 24%, by a quarter.
Yes, there's been a lot of excellent research done on this. I drew on the Brennan Center at NYU, which really goes into this, and they came up with figures like that, which they've really reliably researched, and I felt safe in using. Yes, and all of the states will now say, except for treason and child pornography, anyone can apply, but they make it so difficult. For example, in one state, I don't remember right now, the board that considers your application meets only 3 times a year, you know, that kind of thing.
And in many of these states, especially the southern states, these felon laws were adopted in the period after Reconstruction, right? As they were trying to reestablish the Jim Crow system throughout the South. So in that sense, it was much more directly racially oriented, the codes that were established to drive Blacks off the rolls.
Absolutely. And as we also know, those states then instituted the poll tax, which, hey, wasn't that much money, but people were really poor. And the driver's license, rule is much like the poll tax, because it means you have to spend time and money going to the bureau to get to the polls card.
We're talking to Professor Andrew Hacker. He has written the well-known book, Two Nations, Black and White, Separate, Hostile, Unequal, has a very interesting piece in the New York Review of Books on obstacles to voting, and particularly looking at African Americans. You also talk about how legislation is used, for example, the anti-affirmative action referenda around the country.
Right. This year, two states, Colorado, which is an important state, and Oklahoma, but you never know. But those two states will have on the ballot what's called Civil Rights Initiative. I'm sure everyone who follows this program knows the name Ward Connery. This gentleman, who's based in California, has a mission to go to every state in the union and put repeal of affirmative action on a statewide ballot. He succeeded already in California, in the state of Washington, and in Michigan, where, when they were on the ballot, affirmative action was repealed. You know, for all the Supreme Court decision, the University of Michigan can't use affirmative action anymore. Now, I looked into this, took a bit of digging. In those three states I mentioned, which are fairly liberal states, over 60% of the white voters voted to repeal affirmative action. And in a sense, what Connery was asking them to say is, look, my white civil rights are being violated by affirmative action. I'm not getting this place at the university or law school or whatever. And therefore, they voted that way to repeal. And now it's up in two more states. I will certainly predict that affirmative action will be repealed in those two states. It's a certainty. Why? Because white voters, given the chance, when the ballot booth curtains are closed, are going to vote against it. Whether that will affect the presidential vote is an interesting question.
Because the voter could go in and vote against affirmative action, but still it doesn't necessarily mean whether they're going to vote Democratic or Republican.
It's interesting. In the state of Michigan 2 years ago, and back when the state of Washington had it on the ballot, there were two senators running, Democratic senators, Patty Murray and Debbie Stabenow, Democrats. And actually, even though affirmative action was repealed, the two women got strong majorities and returned to the Senate. So, or Stabenow was the first time. So apparently voters are willing, forgive me, to psychobabble, to compartmentalize. They'll vote one way affirmative action, but if they want a Democratic senator, they'll vote for her too.
You write, you've been careful not to use the word racism.
Okay, Amy. The book of mine that you mentioned came out quite a few years ago, and I have been doing a lot of writing on race. I've lectured, at 100 colleges, at least, and I've discovered that if I, in, say, speaking, use the word racism or racist, those two six-letter words, the whites in the audience freeze. They don't want to hear that word. It's not me. I respect Colin Powell. I love Oprah Winfrey. I admire Tiger Woods. I've got black friends, you know, all that sort of thing. So I've discovered, maybe it's a strategic matter, never to use the word racist because I can't get across what I want to. Now, between you and me and a couple of million other people, racism, of course, exists. We know that, and in all sorts of ways, and it's going to have an effect in the current election. But I'm not using the word. So here I am using it, saying I'm not using it.
and you get into that in the article, the impact on the race itself in terms of how voters view whether they will vote for an African-American candidate or not.
Now, this is very tricky because if you ask people, whether it's in a poll or interviewing man or woman in the street, they'll say, if I'm opposed to Obama, race has nothing to do with it. You know, they may talk about his policies, they may talk about his lack of experience, or even, if they want to, they'll say, he looks to me like an intellectual snob, which, by the way, is a nice white term. It's, how often do you hear that blacks are called intellectual snob? Anyway, so they'll use non-racial reasons. But the more we look at voting returns, we more discover that people don't exactly tell the truth when they're asked about race in elections. I won't go into the details, but there's something called the Bradley effect, which, as I look at the numbers, I'd say that generally, sounds a bit strange, when a black and a white candidate are running against each other, this happens occasionally, and certainly it's happening right now, 7% of the whites will say, I'm voting for the black person, and they're not really going to. They're not telling the truth. And I'm really bemused by this. Who are they saying this to? A white poller whom they don't know, will never see again? They're still lying. Or an exit poll, they're lying. And I wonder, what's going on? Because they just voted for the white candidate, but they say they didn't.
On that note, I want to thank you very much, Andrew Hacker, for being with us. His piece in the New York Review of Books is called Obama, The Price of Being Black, Restoring the Right to Vote. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. When we come back, a new film out with a number of stars, The Battle of Seattle. Stay with us.